are planning a joint conference virtually on April 12th and 13th. The title is Investing Forest Infrastructure, Priorities, Collaboration, and Outcomes, and we'll build on the topics discussed today. We'll put a link to the IFRP website in the chat, and we've got a handy dashboard tool on forest restoration progress in Idaho. Now, the impetus for today's webinar was the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the hundreds of millions of dollars allocated for forest thinning and watershed restoration, and the keen interest of collaborative members in putting this funding to work on the ground in their communities and backyards. Following the presentations from today's great guest speakers, we're going to have an interactive breakout session to discuss the implications for forest collaboratives. This is your chance to talk about how to get this work done on the ground. Now, the breakout session is going to focus on the following topics: opportunities funded by the infrastructure bill, roadblocks as we see them to getting work done on the ground, and then solutions that the Forest Service, partners, and collaboratives can use to overcome these roadblocks and increase the pace and scale of forest restoration. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. So starting off, we have Chris French, the Deputy Director of the U.S. Forest Service, Bill Imbergamo, Executive Director of the Federal Forest Resource Coalition, a nationwide industry coalition representing purchasers of Forest Service and BLM timber in 36 states, and Steve Moyer, the Vice President of Government Affairs, Trout Unlimited, who leads their government affairs, advocacy, and agency partnership work. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand the virtual mic over to Chris French. And Chris, after you're done, I can step in and introduce Bill. All right, let's get going.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, John. And it's nice to be with everybody here today. We're really at I think, an unprecedented time, as all of you are aware, for the first time, I think, really going from a sense of a deficit frame of the type of work that we know that needs to occur across our national forest, whether it's protecting communities, watersheds, or the broader restoration that we see across our forests, of always being in that place of saying the biggest limit we have is capacity and resources, to suddenly finding ourselves in a place of saying, okay, for the next 5 years, we're in a completely different place. And the opportunity we have in front of us is really different than where we've been in the past. And so what do we do with that? And how are we working forward? So what I'm going to take a few minutes is describe to you from our standpoint how we're approaching that. So what I want to start off first by saying is that when you look at the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and I often, and given some of the announcements that we've just made on our 10-year fuel strategy, I often see people just bringing those together. And the reality is that the bipartisan infrastructure deal is actually much broader than just the fuels piece of our work. And so the 10-year strategy is really one piece of things that we're moving forward. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then there is essentially the rest of the things that came through the bipartisan infrastructure deal that we're implementing and how we're approaching that. And then don't forget, there's other pieces that either created by the bill or through our regular appropriations that we're also sitting now looking at and saying, okay, how are we going to go forward with some of this? And those pieces are like our regular appropriations, the president's budget. Right now we're operating under a CR, but like the bipartisan infrastructure deal also actually brought in the Replant Act, which has changed essentially the funding that we can use for reforestation. And so there's this broader set of things that it's always really important, I think, for us to see in that big picture. Otherwise, we just talk about a piece of it. And I think that's where sometimes things get a little confusing. So let me first start by saying one part of managing or implementing the bipartisan infrastructure deal is our work on implementing the 10-year wildfire strategy. And our broader wildfire crisis strategy It was essentially established to dramatically increase fuels and forest health treatments by up to 4 times our current treatment levels across the West. Introduced by Chief Moyer and Secretary Vilsack, it really leaned forward on near-term actions that provide long-term consequences. It's focused on science, on developing high-risk fire sheds, large forested landscapes with a high likelihood of ignition that could expose homes, communities, infrastructure, and natural resources to wildfire. These areas are prioritized based on risk, and we're going through a series of roundtables right now with partners to start talking about how we do that. The intent here is to identify those areas where we can have the greatest impact from our work. And this prioritization, this risk-based prioritization is critical for us, because what we had found before is that we were just trying to do some work in all places. And what we realized is that 80% of the risk to communities, to homes, to infrastructure was being driven by this subset of acres, 10 to 20% of the acres. And so the 10-year wildfire strategy really focuses in, how do you focus in on those in order to create an outcome? Now, I think the other thing that's really important is that the bipartisan infrastructure deal provides over $3 billion focused on hazardous fuels reduction. And that money is really being focused on this 10-year wildfire crisis strategy. It's a down payment. It's not enough to pay for the full amount, but that's what we're focusing on. At the same time, we have our fuels money that we get through our regular appropriation every year. And sometimes we're getting more in certain places, like we just did in the CR that we just got. We're using that to maintain our existing program across the country. So for places like Southeast, our Region 8, who are saying, hey, wait a second, are we not going to continue prescribed fire and maintaining these large areas? The answer is no. We're using our regular appropriation that we get through Congress to maintain and do some of the fuels work that we've been doing across the agency. But we're using essentially the funding that came through the bipartisan infrastructure deal to really focus on these opportunities to hit the 10-year wildfire strategy. Okay, so that was one part of the bipartisan infrastructure deal. The second part to look at is, at least for me in NFS, is this huge section that's associated with ecosystem restoration. And that section essentially brought about $2.1 billion over 5 years for a whole set of other actions for us to be looking at, whether it's financial assistance to the forest products industry and how we do forest restoration, or looking at aquatic restoration, or even restoration of recreation sites, and creating a fund for us to do large scale landscape restoration work. And so we're using this to basically complement that fuel strategy, because we have a broad set of work on restoration outside of just the fuels work that we have to do. And so what this essentially does is gives us a lot more resources to expand those programs. And I think that's especially true in places like Idaho, Montana, throughout Utah, Nevada, places like that, where we have this broad set of restoration work, but may not be those same high priority, super high priority fuels work. Because what we see when we look at the bipartisan infrastructure deal and we combine that with our broader appropriations, is that every region of the agency is going to see a substantive increase in their capacity, a substantive increase in their outcomes and the work we're doing. It's going to be reflected in different ways. In some areas, it's going to be highly focused on high priority fuels and wildfire reduction. In other areas, it's going to be focused on, let's say, aquatic restoration or invasives or broad scale forest restoration. And so our strategy right now is we have a dedicated leadership team led by an executive of Brian Farabee that's really looking at that fuels piece. And then for these other pieces, the other deputy chiefs like myself are working on those bigger sections, working with the regions about how we essentially deliver the rest of this over the next 5 years. We've already working with all of our regional foresters. We're very focused on building capacity of how to deliver this. We are going through a national collective hiring work right now. We're essentially trying to increase capacity by nearly 20% across the board in other regions. And now what we're doing is we're sitting down going through each line item of the bipartisan infrastructure deal, looking at what it is that we have to achieve, how that relates to the 10-year wildland fuel strategy, and then comparing that to the broader budget that we're getting through either our regular appropriations or the funding that's going to come in through the Replan Act or through some of these other pieces, and trying to create balance throughout the agency so that we're creating a large set of work across the agency. So that's that bigger view that I would give everyone as we go forward. One other piece I'd throw in here is that one of the things that we're realizing is that between Great American Outdoors Act, the roads pieces and other infrastructure pieces that are in the bipartisan infrastructure deal, is that many of the taps or many of the barriers that we have felt in the past that got in the way, let's say, of broad scale forest restoration, is actually allowing us to do some of that work in a different way, rather than carrying all that work, let's say, on the back of a vegetation management agreement or contract, or a timber sale contract. There are other ways for us to do this right now, which I think is going to be good for us and all our partners, and doing a much wider variety of work and basically a different economic model. So I appreciate the time today. I look forward to hearing from Steve and from Bill, and I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
That's great. Really appreciate that. What we'll do is type your questions for Chris in the chat. I've got several, but I'll want to go ahead and pass the mic over to Bill Imbergamo with the Federal Forest Resource Coalition, and hear his perspective on this. Thanks, Bill.
Hi, sorry about that. Here is my screen. I'm going to just quickly put up some of the basics here. Oops, this is, I only wanted 2 slides. I thought I'd just review real quickly the buckets of money that are available under this bill. And first of all, I want to say that, you know, as we go forward with implementing this, the thing I just counsel the Forest Service on, and I think I need to remind everybody, it's a little less difficult with people in the West, is as you go forward with implementing this, remember what it was like last summer when smoke was literally blanketing the entire country because half of the Shasta and half of the Lassen National Forest was on fire at one time. And we literally had smoke so thick you could smell it in Wilmington, North Carolina, and in New Haven, Connecticut, where I have family members. And that's what people need to be thinking about as we implement this. And that was certainly, I think, the driving force between the coalition that came together and supported getting these funds into the infrastructure package. And it was a very broad coalition: Nature Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, other hook and bullet groups, state forestry associations, state forestry agencies, all supported getting this done. And it is historic, and I will focus on the fuels piece. So as Chris said, you know, I think there is the infrastructure bill, and then there are a few other pots of money. And the thing I don't want to lose is there were also new authorities granted in this bill. Not just Replant Act and topping up certain programs that already existed. There was a authorization for emergency actions consistent with forest plans that will allow projects to go forward more quickly, and will tell courts not to issue injunctions unless the plaintiffs have a high likelihood of succeeding on the merits. And there's also another new categorical exclusion for the creation of fuel breaks in the infrastructure bill. And as Chris noted, there was this other pot of money, $175 million for post-wildfire restoration and recovery, another $175 million for hazardous fuels mitigation projects, and close to $500 million for capital improvement and maintenance. So that's 3.9 billion in additional funds just in that bill. In digging a little deeper into the where the money went, there's another 100 million in CFLR money, and I'm just talking Forest Service numbers here, not BLM numbers. 400 million in mechanical thinning and timber harvesting, $500 million in community wildfire defense grants, 250 million for fuel breaks, 100 million for removing flammable vegetation, specifically for the creation of biochar, 400 million for assistance to wood using facilities, and 130 million for reforestation. And then the other thing to keep in mind here is that, as Chris said, this is in addition to regular appropriations. The hazardous fuel reduction account within the Forest Service has been the fastest growing account at the agency, bar none, since 2009. It's hard to do apples to oranges. I mean, it's hard to do apples to apples comparisons. Excuse me. It's really easy to sit there and try to figure out the apples to oranges now, but with a budget restructure, it's a little harder to follow. But hazardous fuels has grown dramatically since 2009. And it is now the largest single line item within the National Forest System budget. In addition to all of those new pots of money and new authorities, I don't know how many people are watching Ted Lasso. What's the happiest animal on the planet? A goldfish, because it doesn't have any memory. We can't all be goldfish here. Congress has, since 2003, enacted numerous authorities to give the Forest Service tools and funding and authority to get work done more quickly, particularly on fire-prone acres. Starting with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, expanded in 2011 to expand expedited administrative appeals to all forest management projects. The insect and disease treatment categorical exclusion in the 2014 Farm Bill, permanent stewardship contracting authority in the 2014 Farm Bill, the expansion of Good Neighbor to all 50 states in the 2014 Farm Bill, and then in the 2018 Farm Bill, the insect and disease CE had an added purpose of hazardous fuels reduction. And then also in the fall of 2018, just before the longest government shutdown on record, I'm not saying Congress is always easy to work with, they enacted a fire funding fix. And, I think we can only look at this tranche of money that's been handed to the agency in that context. Congress has gone a long way to give the agency the authority and the funding that it needs to get work done on the national forest. It is not, the thing I was heartened with in the 10-year strategy was it said, look, we need $50 billion. And that's great to lay that number out there. The thing I would hope that groups on the ground want to see out of the Forest Service with this money is, quite frankly, the agency needs to put Congress on the back foot here. There's a scarcity mindset within the agency that we can't start projects if we don't have the money to do all the work that we want to do. I say it's time to start moving out and getting projects done, and then go into Congress and say, hey, you challenge us to do this work. And we can do it, and demonstrate that you can do it by funding implementable projects. And then when it comes down to it, a few years from now, and you've spent through this pile of money, you can say, we got your results. You need to fund it. You need to continue funding this work. The last thing I'll say, just from an industry perspective, is I appreciate all the work that collaboratives closer to the ground do. These are very, very difficult issues. The kinds of negotiations that people like Moyer and I engage in up here at the national level aren't anywhere near as naughty or as real as the ones you all deal with closer to the ground. So, what I hope is that these authorities that we manage to get through actually make your jobs easier and result in real projects on the ground. And obviously, as a representative of industry, I believe that where there is timber value, you can get more work done and you can extend treatment onto more acres than you can where you don't have an industry to help you get that work done. Where there is timber value, you can create receipts and expand treatment. We've seen that over and over again, not just in the West. And that doesn't mean that we don't need to treat those more difficult acres where there's no commercial value. But my God, we've got to take advantage of industry where we have it. And, you know, whenever I hear a chief or anybody else like a Chris French say, our biggest problem is low value material, my initial and strongest answer is don't make any more of it by losing the industry partners that you have. And that's what I hope with a sense of urgency we move on to with this tranche of funding that's in the bill. So I'll shut up.
Bill, thanks so much. Really appreciate that. And if folks have questions for Bill, please use the chat. Well, after we conclude our presenters, we're going to have a couple of minutes to review the questions and pick and choose among them. Probably won't get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And then it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Moyer with Trout Unlimited. And Steve's going to give a perspective from the conservation community. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, John. Danny, if you could bring up the first slide when you get a chance. I'll just say that I think I agreed with Bill about 99% of Bill's talk, which, you know, is up from the usual 98%. So very, very good presentation. And Chris, I loved yours. Thank you to IFRP and ICL and NFF for inviting me, and great to have members of Congress staff as well as the cooperatives and the Forest Service. I'm an Eastern Rube, I'll admit that, and but I am a great appreciator of Idaho. The very first Idaho contact I had was when my girlfriend and I, soon to be my wife, in 1984, we're driving along the southern Idaho plains and suddenly found ourselves driving across this bridge over the Snake River that came up out of nowhere. And my wife just said, whoa. And since then, I've learned that Idaho has a lot of woes, like woes. And I've been very fortunate to be part of an organization that does a good deal of work in Idaho and has tremendous staff there to get the work done. And I try to help them and support them. And we're always trying to be a good partner in a collaborative. And if we don't, please let us know. So context, Bill talked about that as well as Chris. Just a mention about that. Always looking for a joke to start off our presentation. Well, infrastructure was a joke for a long time in Congress. Every year had an infrastructure week priority that just never happened. But finally it did in November. And as Bill said, just a historic, once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime thing happened, and Congress finally got it done. The administration deserves a lot of credit. The House had some great champions, but I just want to speak to the Senate and the ability of the Senate to find bipartisan supporters to make the bill pass. Well, it's a rare thing to get anything done in the Congress. It's a rare thing to have bipartisan support, and people like Senator Crapo and Senator Risch really deserve a lot of credit for being among the number that made this happen. So next one, please. They passed this bill because they were hopeful that we could get something done. All of us on this call, all of us around the country, they put the reputations on the line in Congress because they thought we could get something done. So, one of my biggest point is about hope and about being hopeful with this once in a generation opportunity. $1 trillion doesn't come around very often, although lately it's come around a few times, but it really is an enormous sum of money, and we have a great opportunity in front of us. Next one, please, Danny. And it's not your father's or your grandfather's infrastructure bill. It's not just about bridges, although God knows it needs to be about bridges or roads or airports. But one of the big things that happened this time on this infrastructure bill was that things like watershed health and wildfire, rivers and streams were really big priorities for this infrastructure bill. So, another piece of important context, I think, is that we have this rare and new opportunity to do really good things with infrastructure funding. Next one, please, Danny. So, here's my take home, and you've already heard a bunch of this, so I won't go dwell on each point, but just a really good chance to do things on scale and scale up the things that we've done well, often at local levels or small scale. Great chance to scale up. We've got a lot of obstacles, no doubt, and it sounds like we'll talk about them here on other parts of this call. Agencies, and including the Forest Service, understaffed and not having capacity right now to meet the challenge, but I know they're working hard to get it. Things like match requirements for projects, not perfectly clear what that means. Groups like ours want to say that if you want things done quickly, then maybe we shouldn't worry too much about a match requirement on the one hand. On the other hand, we know the administration and Congress wants to see a lot of outside money coming in to leverage this very precious federal money. We see people like Chris French and Chief Moore and others who are in leadership are really good people. I just have to say we have a great group of people in the Forest Service at the top and in the other agencies who are good problem solver, pragmatic people. And we know there'll be a lot of pressure from Congress and from the administration to get projects done quickly, have a high return on investment, and for all of us who are involved in these projects to tell stories. But it's just, it's our time to shine. We've been building relationships with each other over time. We've been talking about the need for money. We've been telling Congress we need money, and by golly, they gave the agencies money to do the work. Next one, please, Danny. So just a quick view of some of the restoration pots, and I know these numbers just keep coming and coming, and it's hard to make sense of it all. But just a quick overview. I think, as Chris French said, probably 2 to 4 times as much as baseline for things like ecosystem restoration. A really cool thing that we see in this bill is the Joint Chiefs pot of money, where the NRCS and the Forest Service can work together on projects where projects could be done on Forest Service land that'll have benefit to the private landowners downstream of the National Forest, and the NRCS can contribute funding as well into that pot, so you get a good Forest Service federal land, private land benefit going. Legacy roads and trails, we're really hopeful that culverts, a lot of the bad culverts that don't allow fish to pass on the National Forest, can be upgraded so the roads don't blow out when it floods, and the fish, salmon and trout, can pass. And then one of the things I could talk a long time about, but I won't too much, is that we worked with the hydro industry to come up with source of funding to do all sorts of things with the 90,000 dams we have across the country, retrofit them, upgrade them, and then take some of the clunkers out so that they're not a hazard to downstream communities, and they allow fish to pass. And the Forest Service got a little $10 million chunk of money that came out of that effort. Next one, Danny. And then just to highlight that the BLM is right there as well. I know, even though I am an Eastern Rube, that the Forest Service BLM lands are often right next to each other. They're intermixing, and the BLM has a nice big chunk of money for ecosystem restoration that we hope will work well and fit well with the Forest Services. And then I also wanted to mention our abandoned mine cleanup work, which is a big thing for TU in the West. And there was a new fund established that has a $3 billion authorization not appropriation yet, so we've got to get money into that. But we're excited about the opportunity to increase the pace and scale of abandoned mine cleanup in Idaho and other places around the West. Next one, Danny, please. And then just a quick mention of another agency or two. NOAA has funding for salmon that can reach up into Idaho and does through the Pacific Coastal Salmon Restoration Fund, and through these other two programs mentioned here, the community-based restoration and the new barrier removal funding, which came out of that 3Rs dam coalition work I just mentioned. Hopefully we can really get the agencies working together. And Danny, maybe the next one, please. One of the big hopes we have is that bigger scale, multi-agency efforts and contributions to a pot for special places in Idaho and other places around the West. And we've seen some of this already in places like the Yakima Basin over in Washington, and of course, Klamath. There's a lot of good work going on there. And of course, other places smaller, but just as significant throughout the West. It'd be just great if the federal agencies could really work with us and together to try to find the special places that really warrant a lot of collaboration among themselves to take full advantage of the new money. And one thought that we had is we'd especially like to see and would like to work on is the Forest Service and BLM working. We're often, the Forest Service is up in the mountains, upstream, working with the Bureau where the Bureau projects are downstream, so you can really conserve water and water resources from the upper part of the watershed down into the valley. So, just really good collaborative opportunities among agencies here. Danny, one more, please. So I'll just end with this. It just seems like such a middle of the road, problem solving, collaborative kind of law that was passed, and that's what we hope it will be. It will not be without hurdles and barriers and some tough days, I'm sure, to get the money to the ground well, but it's a fantastic opportunity. It's on people like TU and others, once that projects are done well, to tell stories and really develop the support for the work, because we want to, I think Bill said it well, we want to see this investment sustained. We don't want this to be a one and done kind of thing. We want the support, we want the roots to grow deep, and we want the commitment to stay strong to keep funding coming over time. So that's what I have, I think, Danny.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Steve. Really appreciate it. And then I'm going to turn it over to Danny Southard just to help direct questions to the appropriate panelists as we go through.
Okay, thanks everyone. A really informative panel. We appreciate that. I'm going to move us all the way back up towards the top of the chat box, and some really good questions showing up in that chat. You can keep them coming. And we'll go ahead. We're going to move through a few of these different questions right now. If your question doesn't get answered here, we'll work with Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership and the speakers and see if we can get some answers back out to the group. So I'm going to go ahead. We'll kick off with a question towards Chris. And the question is, the elephant in the fuels management room is the Clean Air Act and the EPA. Do you think that we can get the necessary acres treated under the current smoke management rules?
I think, yeah. I mean, so here's what I mean by that is we're working closely with EPA right now, and they have been part of an interagency working group with FLIC, and part of a broader focus and discussion on the National Secretarial Interagency Working Group to really look at changing or adapting our processes with EPA for doing that managed fire. So I actually see a lot of progress that in the last year or so. I think there's a recognition that uncontrolled wildfire has a much more deleterious effect than managed fire. And if we're doing mechanical or other type treatments pre-bringing fire back into those systems, again, the air quality is greatly reduced. So I actually see good progress there, Danny.
Great, thanks. John Robinson, do you want to ask the next question or you want me to take it?
Sure. I think there's a good one that came in from Dr. Becker about just can the panelists speak more to opportunities on adjacent private forest lands through NRCS or other channels? I think I'll direct that, start with Chris for that, of kind of more of how much work we're getting toward the all hands, all lands vision with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just made a series of announcements on our Joint Chiefs projects just to this exact issue. We have a great working relationship with NRCS, and we recognize that if you're going to reduce wildland fire potential, or if you're going to look at broader restoration, let's say of a watershed, that you have to look at the full matrix of lands. It's not just the public lands, it's also our actions on private lands. Incentivizing and working closely with NRCS has been a broad focus of ours. And Joint Chiefs, I think, is a great example of that, of places where both agencies are funding two sides of doing work together that are creating these sorts of outcomes. So I will just see there's a number of pieces going forward where we're trying to incentivize that cross-boundary approach, and NRCS is probably our biggest partner on that, as well as working through states and some of their actions, and our partners through NGOs.
Let's lean into that one maybe a little more. We had a good question in here that was asking about the role of volunteer-based organizations and or collaboratives. So an example that was used was Idaho Trails Association. What role can those types of groups play in restoring and improving legacy trails?
Well, I don't want to take all the questions, so Steve or Bill, but I'm not sure if you want to take on a trails question. What I would tell you is this: we know that we have to build our capacity in the agency to address almost all this restoration work. And the chief and our leadership has said, when we talk about building capacity, it's not just hiring people, but it's building our partner capacity. I see great opportunities for volunteer organizations to work with us to do a lot of this work. And the people we're hiring now, part of our mindset is hiring a different type of workforce, not necessarily the people that are out doing the trail work, but that we're hiring people to enable the groups and partners that we work with to better facilitate or for them to do the work. We've also been talking really closely and working with Congress to look at changing match requirements and partnership agreements so we can better leverage that capacity. The sheer amount of work that's ahead of us and that is contained in this bill, to be honest with you, we cannot afford not to have every tool in the toolbox, whether it's an authority, whether it's a type of project that we're doing, like a type of action, or working with a state, working with a private volunteer organization, NGO, with a contractor, or working with other federal agencies, or hiring people ourselves to do it. I think the only way that we're going to be able to scale up in the way that we would like to is by leveraging all of that.
Steve and Bill, anything to add to that?
If I could, I would say I love what Chris said, and we really see the truth of that in the engagement we've had with the agency about how they're trying to make it easier to be a good partner with them, and we really appreciate that. I would just say to trails groups or others that go to your Forest Service people, your best points of contacts, and talk about the projects that you would like to see done. There needs to be some confluence of priorities within the agency and within the partners to really figure out what the priority should be for spending the money. We can't do it all at once. We're going to have to break it down into bits. Just be patient and realize that maybe your priority may not be the very first year priority, but maybe it could be the second or the third or the fourth year. And then the other thing is the just the downstream off of the National Forest Service land into private land. That's where industry and groups like TU and others can really bring people together, right? Nobody can make anybody do a project, a private landowner do a project even no matter how good it is. You've got to work with the landowner, help them get the processing done, find the value for the private landowner that really fits with the project. So, those are the kinds of things that we can do, that we want to do to make everything work well.
Steve, I would just to echo what you said, we mean what we say. We're talking some large agreements with partners right now, but what I talked about, we were hiring right now. Our first set of hires across the agency, which we just completed, we hired nearly 100 grants and agreements and partnership specialists. That was our first move out of the gate, because we recognized this work with our partners and with volunteer groups and NGOs is critical for us to do this work going forward.
And I would just add that, local groups are really well positioned to bring to the agency's attention projects that may have been on the drawing board or might have even been analyzed that, didn't go forward because either the timber economics didn't work or because there wasn't a budget for specific activities. One example that I saw in recent years was down in Florida, where the Forest Service dropped an entire several thousand acre area from consideration in a project because they didn't have a roads budget. They didn't have the money to repair one bridge. And that literally just cut off a huge area from consideration for management. We've got two things now that we didn't have when a project like that was modified. We've got at the moment extraordinarily strong lumber markets, which are driving industry to be out looking for stumpage, and we've got all of these pots of money that can fill those gaps in those projects. As Chris said, in the past we've tried to put the cost for all of those resource considerations into the timber value.
Right.
And it's really time to start looking at a different model that says, hey, okay, some of this fiber is going to wind up at a mill and somebody running that mill is going to make some level of profit on that, but we can't therefore expect that timber project or that timber aspect of this project to cover all of the project costs. Mm-hmm. And volunteer groups are going to be much, much more aware of that level of granular detail than, any of the three graybeards you see on the screen here are. I don't know those things unless I happen to have been on that NFS unit, and you guys are there every day.
I've got another question just about, I think it's kind of clear that there's definitely is a role for collaboratives and local communities to speak out for what they're seeing in their backyards and out in the woods and in the streams, and raising those to the Forest Service's attention, to their partners, trying to move things together. And there's, in addition to the whole suite of tools that we're just all learning about, and this is great, there's also, I think it's about $100,000 to be made available to the Secretary of Agriculture for collaboration and collaborative-based activities, including facilitation, certification of collaboratives, planning and implementing projects under CFLR. And so there's a good amount of funding for that. And I know that from, some collaboratives definitely are all in different stages of growth and development and reforming and all these things. Certainly, I think some assistance can be helpful in helping, bring folks together, really building that zone of agreement on there. What's the sense of how that funding might help individual collaboratives, both in the CFLR landscapes and also those that aren't designated as CFLR? Maybe something about Chris about how funding for collaboratives, how that might sort out, and how to track that conversation.
Yeah, so this was, when we were being asked, and I think a number of our partner groups were being asked by Congress about the sorts of things that would be helpful in moving this forward. One of the things that many folks we talked about was at times we recognize that collaboration and local collaboratives help really facilitate getting outcomes and projects that are successful. The issue often is, how do you pay for the basic delivery infrastructure, meeting space, those sorts of things. There are folks, when we're bringing in folks from some communities that need subsidies for transportation, and we need to have their voices in the room, things like that. And yet we were struggling more and more without some specific authority from Congress to say you can spend money in this way to help fund those collaboratives, even though we knew that they had great outcomes on the ground. And so I think the bipartisan infrastructure deal recognized what they were hearing and gives us an opportunity to really look at the focus of those collaboratives and how to deliver, how to help them. Now, in the context of this, we're really focusing in on those collaboratives that will help deliver our broad wildland fuel reduction strategy. But we'll be working with our regions to help identify priority landscapes, the collaboratives that are part of that, and this funding will help, I think, remove a lot of barriers and obstacles in making those collaboratives successful.
That's great. And also, just to point out, I misspoke on that, and it's that whole package of funding is going to be $100 million over a 5-year period, and certain allotments out there. So there's a lot to work with on there. And I think that the follow through of the previous commitments is really important. And it's at IFRP, it's our job to support the local collaboratives wherever they are in this.
Great. Let's see, we've probably got time for one more. We've got a nice multi-prong question coming in on the chat from Tom Schultz, and I'm going to put Tom Schultz on the spot to just ask this one directly. So Tom, can I have you plug in on this?
So yeah, Tom Schultz with IFG. First of all, I want to thank everybody for their participation. This is a great turnout, and really appreciate the attention on these issues. A couple of things. When I'm concerned about obstacles potentially to get funding out, and some things we've heard about is that there's concerns about language in the bill about ecologically appropriate treatments on the ground, and I'm kind of curious how much of an obstacle people think that language might actually be. Another question: we've heard rumors that OMB is basically concerned about releasing the money, since we're still operating under a CR, and that this is next year's funding. So is that an obstacle, or is that not an obstacle? And then finally, I had a good discussion with Lan the other day about just projects in North Idaho, and there's different funding sources coming in, Joint Chiefs projects and other things. There's priorities about getting staff hired, but I'm just kind of curious where in the mix we see North Idaho in terms of receiving some of this infrastructure funding. Are we looking at year 3? Are we thinking year 2? But kind of what does that look like in terms of when North Idaho might get some of this funding? So appreciate it.
All right, so 3 big questions in there. The first one, challenges of the language itself and the conditions within the bill and our ability to deliver some of this. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that there's an awful lot of conditioning in a lot of these requirements in here. I think, though, that we feel comfortable with the way that the wording is written and the variety of funding sources that are available and the variety of funding sources that we have available to us, that it should not limit our ability to complete the work that is one part of our broader 10-year wildland fire strategy, or in terms of the broader forest restoration work that we want to do, Tom. So I think we're good there. There has been quite a bit of work with OMB to create, basically we just got a portion of the money. Maybe I'll just go there. We had a lot of back and forths, but we just now received the apportionment of funds for the first year of this. So it's about midway through the year, but now we can start working on how do we actually allocate that out and for what. But that just happened late last week. But we had to build a spend plan and things like that. So that's why you were hearing that. In terms of what's going to come to Idaho, I don't know for sure the total amount, but again, if you look at the major pots of funding that are in here, the wildland fire risk reduction funding and the broader ecosystem restoration funding. I think that you'll see a substantive increase in funding to regions 1 and 2 where Idaho is. And I think it'll be in a number of buckets. Some of it will be in fuels, some of it will be in broader forest restoration, some of it will be in terms of our forest products work, some of it will be in aquatic restoration and invasives. Across the board, you're going to see substantive increases in all regions. I think in our western regions, you'll see appropriate fuels-related increases, especially in those priority areas that we've talked about. But all regions will see substantive increases in there because of the way this money is set up. So the reason I said it that way is I've heard some concern after we made the announcement of the 10-year wildland fire strategy, where we talked about some of those high priority areas. Well, if I live in New Mexico or in Idaho and I didn't see that state named, am I not going to be a receiver of some of these bipartisan infrastructure funds? And the answer is yes, you are going to receive funds. No, it didn't mean that you're not. That was the 10-year wildland fire strategy of how we're trying to focus the majority of fuels dollars, but it goes broader than what was announced in that, and almost half the funding coming through the bipartisan infrastructure deal is for other forest restoration work. And we're going to be creating balance across regions where we may not be putting as much fuels dollars, Tom. That's the bottom line.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to go ahead. We're going to make a transition now for folks. Thanks for all the questions. There's a number of them that weren't answered in the chat. So what I did is I pulled them out. We'll work with the panelists and see if we can get some additional answers to some of those that we didn't discuss. So what's going to happen now is we're going to move you into some facilitated breakout sessions where we've got a few questions that we'll lead through. And you've got about 15 minutes in your breakout groups. I have these already pre-assigned, but if you don't automatically go to a breakout room, just bear with me and I'll move you automatically. And for those of you that are facilitating, look for a 2-minute warning from me, and I'll let you know when we bring you back. But we'll be bringing you all back to the full group at about 2:15 Mountain Standard Time.
And also let me add, we're not going to be recording the breakout groups. And so this is a good chance just to zing ideas out there,